Our next session is about mobilizing innovative financing for infrastructure, manufacturing, and real estate. For those of you who are trying to dabble into these sectors for investment, how can you get innovative financing, which again is Sharia compliant? Now, our Mr. Airman Boyle, Executive Vice President and Head of Advisory Group, Indonesia Infrastructure Finance, Indonesia. Mr. Airman Boyle. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our first panelist, please. They've taken time out from the busy schedules to be here for you. We also have our next panelist, Mr. Hamid Rashid, the founder of Fintera Private Limited, Singapore, as our next panelist. Mr. Hamid Rashid. Another round of applause for Mr. Hamid Rashid, please. And our final panelist, who is an IAS, Mr. S. Krishnan IAS, the Principal Secretary, Housing and Urban Development Department, Government of Tamilnadu, India. A fantastic and erudite speaker, if you listen to him speak, and we are glad that he is here on the panel today. Now, introduce them further, and to moderate the session, we have an academician par excellence with over 30 years' experience in academics. He is the President and CEO of the International Center for Education in Islamic Finance, the Global University of Islamic Finance. Prior to that, he was also Director General of Islamic Research and Training for the Islamic Development Bank Group, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and a Senior Professor and University Administrator at the International Islamic University, Malaysia. He has pioneered and introduced many innovative policy researches which has culminated into flagship reports and was awarded the most outstanding individual contribution to Islamic finance at the Kuala Lumpur Islamic Finance Forum Awards 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, our moderator, Professor Dato Dr. Azmi Umar. A big round of applause for him, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. MC. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in the second session. I know we are quite busy, but again, we have the time limitation. We have to finish about maybe 1 o'clock, slightly more than 1 o'clock. We have a topic on mobilizing innovative financing for infrastructure, manufacturing, and real estate. Earlier this morning, when we had the opening session, we had the explanation by the Deputy Chief Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure talking about the requirements for infrastructure financing in Tamilnadu. Gentlemen, can you please sit down? We are starting the session. We need your support, please. Okay. Let me quote a study done by a G20 initiative body called Global Infrastructure Hub that was established sometime in 2012. They forecast that the need for infrastructure investment is expected to reach 94 trillion by 2040. 94 trillion by 2040, and a further $3.5 trillion will be required to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 SDGs formulated by United Nations way back in 2015. So making a total of $97.5 trillion for infrastructure financing. And Asia as a region requires over half of the funding needs, meaning that Asia, particularly the three major countries, China, India, and Japan, will require about 30% of the funding requirements. And if we zero in the context of India, we have a huge funding needs, estimated to be about $0.5 trillion. $0.5 trillion, which means it's about $526 billion, with investment need of $4.5 trillion and a supply of $3.9 trillion, which means that $526 billion additional funding needs for infrastructure. Then the question that arises from this is that how do you then address this funding gap? So how do you address this funding gap? And one of the alternative ways of looking at addressing the funding gap is to look at Islamic finance, okay, as a source of financing to finance the funding gaps for infrastructure needs of India particularly. And if you look historically, way back from 1990s, where we had the first Sukuk issuance in Malaysia, and subsequently other major syndicated finance and sukuk throughout from 1990s until today, you find that there are many examples that we can look at that India can emulate. For example, we have the Djibouti Port Doraleh in Djibouti, where it was funded by World Bank MIGA, that is the World Bank Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which provided guarantees of $427 million and $5 million from Dubai Port World Equity Investment and 422 million Islamic project financing. That's one example by World Bank MIGA. The second example is where Islamic Development Bank, where I used to be associated with, provided a financing of 100 million for Queen Alia International Airport in Jordan. So you have the example of a port, you have the example of an airport. And the third example is we have the highway project in Malaysia, the East Klang Valley Expressway, which was issued over a tranche of 22 years, and the amount of Islamic medium-term notes of about $1 billion, which is equivalent to about 250 million, 1 billion ringgit, which is equivalent to about 250 million US dollars. And there are, of course, other numerous examples in many other countries. So as you can see, Islamic finance can be used as a funding gap to meet the infrastructure needs of a number of countries. And of course, Tamilnadu is one of the examples that we can discuss earlier. So we have three distinguished speakers to share their thoughts on this. The first speaker, I was told because he has to leave soon, is Hamid Rashid from Fintera, Singapore. Second speaker is Imran Boyle from Indonesia Infrastructure Finance. And third speaker is S. Krishnan, the Principal Secretary of the Government of Tamil Nadu for the housing development. Let me begin by asking Hamid Rashid in the context of,
yes,
because he comes from the fintech side. How can fintech be used to support infrastructure financing? Because as you know, fintech is a neutral platform. It can be used for fundraising for projects. It can be for SDGs. It can be for wakaf. It can also be for zakat even, or it can even be for infrastructure needs. So can we get your thoughts on this?
Yes, Ato. Fintech in the last 3 or 4 years has been very innovative, especially in the financial technology space and revolutionizing how banks have operated. Now, Fintech looks into reprocessing what has been happening in the last 10, 12 years and kind of upgrading it. Now, what has happened with Fintech is the reach, because technology is basically in everybody's pocket today. You're carrying a smartphone. So the technology reach to individuals is huge. And things like, say, crowdfunding, right? Reach is crowdfunding. Ease of use, microfinance, so little petty cash versus large transactions, just becomes easier through technology. So in the space of fintech, there are a lot of different kind of projects running, whether it is upgrading the banking facilities through a mobile banking feature, or it is crowdfunding, funding for property development, or funding for even charity, crowdfund or capital raise. So in the space of fintech lately, in the last few years, a lot of companies are innovating the space itself. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. But let me go on further. I mean,
yes,
you talk about the fintech can be used as a platform, but how do you overcome the barriers of fintech in order to fund large infrastructure projects?
See, in the space for large infrastructure project, fintech is still new. So in mainstream, it will be something like 4+ years in the mainstream. Now, it is basically looking into, say, capital raise. So say the technologies around capital raise, traditional technologies and instruments used, right, could be, say, loan management, right, and the banking systems managing loan. Now, in fintech, the same thing has been done via crowdfund, where different instruments are issued through technology. So it could be a digital loan, or it could be a digital mudaraba contract, digital sukuk, and that is picked up at a small sum, but very high volume of users. So it might be a $10 sukuk, but picked up by 10 million people. And it is picked up instantly because it just goes out on mobile devices through internet, and users can just review the portfolio and purchase it. So far, right, fintech in large infrastructure projects is yet to come, but it is already there for, I would say, small and medium type of projects is already being used in many countries.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we stop at that at the moment. Let me go to the second speaker, Airman Boyle, who is the Executive Vice President for Indonesia Infrastructure Finance. As some of you may be aware, especially under the current President of Indonesia, His Excellency Mr. Jokowi, he has undertaken huge infrastructure projects in Indonesia, be it in the context of highways, ports, metros, and so on. And we see this, the demand for infrastructure in Indonesia will continue in the near future. And he, being a person who's been involved in infrastructure projects in Indonesia, he can share in the context of what has been done and what needs to be done to make Indonesia a country. As you know, Indonesia's population is about 260 million, huge country, the largest Muslim population country in the world, and with about 90% Muslim population. So an example from a Muslim majority country, how they use Islamic finance to fund infrastructure projects. So, Airman, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I think I would like to express my gratitude. It's such a really great honor for me to be able to present before you, sharing some experience of Indonesian accelerating the infrastructure project development. So first, it's about Indonesia infrastructure finance itself. IIF by itself is actually one of the alternative financing that is promoted by the government of Indonesia. IIF by itself is an alternative financing scheme. So I think it's similar to what India has been done with the India Infrastructure Finance Company Limited, IIFCL. So similar like that, the concept. So Ministry of Finance of the Government of Indonesia working together with the multilateral partners, International Finance Corporation, and then ADB, and then DEG. DEG is the private sector arm of KfW. All together, they are acting as the founding shareholders of IIF, Indonesia Infrastructure Finance. So basically, our mandate is to help acceleration of infrastructure development in Indonesia through the provision of investment and advisory services for infrastructure project that is going to be conducted by private sector sponsor. So our focus is basically on infrastructure projects that is being prepared and constructed, operation and maintenance by the private sector. So we have this mandate basically across infrastructure sector initially in power, in road, toll roads, bridge, and then oil and gas facilities, LPG terminals, LNG terminals, for example, and then airports, seaport, telecommunication, fiber optic networks, and also BTS. And lately, just early this year, we also have the expansion on our mandate to include social infrastructure. So we will be able to involve in the financing and advising hospital projects, for example, universities and school, and also urban infrastructure such as a bus terminal, a sport complex. So the design is basically as the following slide will show, that the attribute for acceleration can be only done if the private sector involvement is encouraged. As Pak Asmi earlier mentioned, basically we have a huge gap in infrastructure funding need. In 5 years, from 2015 to 2019, for example, we have this funding need of about 300 billion for 5 years. So about 60 billion per year. So of this 300 billion, basically the government can only provide about 20% of it. And then the government can also assign state-owned enterprises to conduct the projects, but that contribute no more than 30% of the funding gap. So the government will have to refer to the private sector involvement. No other else that can be done without it. So this is how the government basically giving the policy to accelerate the development through the public-private partnerships, the so-called PPP. In this way, basically, the government can still regulate the provision of the infrastructure through the concession contracts. And among other, the policy instruments that the Ministry of Finance invented is the establishment of IIF. So IIF is intended to go where no one will go. Before IIF exists, for example, traditional financing market for infrastructure projects in Indonesia is done by the conventional banks. And they typically extend loan for 5, maximum 7 years on corporate finance basis, usually. But then with the existence of IIF early in 2012, the financing instruments getting more richer. So we will now be able to conduct financing based on project finance, on limited recourse basis. So we don't see the source of project cash flow from any other sources, but only from the project cash flow, from the project revenue, I mean. So, and then we can also extend the loan up to the concession period. For example, up to 20 years, depending on the concession tenors. But so far, the longest financing that we have provided is up to 15 years, for example. So to be able to provide lending financing based on limited recourse basis, only see the project itself, the merit of the project itself, and then that the ability to provide a long tenor financing is not in the market before. Only recently, when the market learned about such product, then the conventional bank can also finance with similar terms. They can now involve in total project financing, for example, with tenor as long as 12 years. They are now comfortable extending loans based on the limited recourse basis. So this is basically the first in the first 5 years on what IIF has been contributing to the financing, infrastructure project financing market in Indonesia, that we are able to introduce the new financing instruments, longer tenors, limited recourse basis, and also some risk participation, such as government guarantee, such as project guarantee that is provided by IIF. So this is basically what the PPP schemes are about. So private sector finance can only come if they are comfortable with the risk associated with the project implementation. So, so the government has been giving incentives, support facilities to such infrastructure projects. So for example, they provided land fund to acquire the project site. And then also they prepare the project development facility that is able to be channeled to all the government contracting authority, to the local government, to the sector ministries, to be able to be used for project feasibility study, to be able so that the ministers can hire good international reputable lawyers to help with the negotiation of the concession agreement, for example. So all this funding needs is provided by the project development facility. And then also we have infrastructure guarantee fund that is basically in replacement of the sovereign guarantee. So for PPP projects, the sovereign guarantee is not issued by the Minister of Finance, but issued by the IIGF, Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Fund. By using this scheme, basically IIGF can hire a good and reputable professional. So they are very conversant in project finance, in negotiating concession contract, in negotiating financing agreement. So instead of civil servant negotiating such long-term contract, such complicated power purchase agreement, for example. Now, IIGF will equip it with the good lawyers, with the investment banker, for example. They are more comfortable in negotiating the term of such sovereign government guarantee. And then we also the so-called affability payment. So this is basically for project that is not really viable in itself. So the government is willing to assume demand risk. So for example, the toll road projects. Toll road projects typically have a long ramp-up period, up to 7 or 8 years, for example. So during this period, the government is able to guarantee that a certain level of project revenue will be obtained by the project sponsor. And by this guarantee, basically the banks will be comfortable in providing the project finance. And then we also have this hybrid and blended financing. The more that the project is developed, the project is located, for example, western part of Indonesia is more advanced compared to the eastern part. And then the more projects that is being developed, the more difficult they are. So projects in remote area, projects that will involve mega billions funding need, for example. So if such project is trusted only to the private sector, they are not going to build it. So we developed the concept of blended financing at which public sector finance, government budget, also contribute to the projects. So for example, for this is the development of container terminal, for example, all together with the surrounding facilities, the breakwater, for example, the port. So this is such huge investment requirement that private sector alone will not be able to finance it. So to leverage this kind of financing needs, basically the government, Ministry of Finance, is providing a contribution, a small amount of contribution, for example, to help with the public facility of the projects. So we will see now how this concept of PPP, public-private partnership, is aligned with the Sharia financing principles. So, for example, this asset-based project finance done on PPP usually is contributed with the responsibility of the private sector to construct an asset and then operate and maintain the asset along during the tenure period, for example. So this is similar to Sharia financing, which require that that such asset is being developed and being guaranteed for financing. And then also the project is ring-fenced in terms of that the source of payment for financing does not coming from anywhere else, only from the projects. As this is related to the source of payment, for example. The source of payment can come from the user fee, for example, from the offtake payment done by the contracting authority, or from the affability payment. So this is a very clear source of payment, and very there is no speculative manner in the project terms. And then next is the risk-sharing mechanism. As I think earlier speakers already indicated, what fair about Islamic financing is basically equal, and equitable risk participation. So this is also some things that is aligned with the that can be provided by the PPP projects. So in Indonesia, I should admit that basically we are still growing, Pak. We are still growing. The Sharia-based financing is less than 10% of the total banking asset. And up to now, we have these assets of about 400 trillion rupiah. So that's about 30 billion US dollar of assets, of which it is equally distributed to both consumer and also productive investment. And the market is dominated by state-owned enterprises, Mandiri, for example, and then BNI, BRI, and then the Malaysian bank also contributed in the big 10 of the market, Maybank and then CMMB, for example. So these all together, basically, so we are not as mature as Malaysia. We are just starting, and there is still big room for growth opportunity for Syariah financing in Indonesia. And as the next slide that will show, we are trying to leverage from this, that we are going to exploit the source of Islamic financing more. First, is that we want to introduce Syariah financing early in the project planning and design. So in addition to feasibility study, designing the project structure, concession agreement, we will also develop a funding plan at which Syariah financing is considered. And in the transaction phase is also being offered. So this has not been done before, Pak. So this is something new, an effort that is the government trying to do. We are, IF, for example, together with IIGF, the guarantee fund, together with the Ministry of Finance, together with the National Development Planning Agency, BAPENAS, we are trying to develop such scheme at which funding plan can accommodate the financing offer, including the Syariah financing, early in the project planning and design phase. And later in the transaction phase, this financing can be offered to all bidders. It will be equally and fairly available to all the bidders, so they can easily prepare their bid and submit develop their project plan. So this is one of the breakthroughs that we try to develop. And then second is that we try to implement the Syariah financing through for thematic project. So the government is developing Islamic hospital, for example, universities and school, and then urban infrastructures. So it's happened, for example, in Indonesia, that contracting authorities for such project lie with the local government. And some local government have political domain that is in which Islamic voters are the majority. So there's an opportunity for the local government to develop the projects and finance it with the thematic theme, which is the Islamic. This is a pure Islamic project, and also develop it with Islamic financing. So this may ring politically well with the certain local government at which they have this political basis to start with. And then, here I also highlight some of the experience that we've done before for infrastructure projects. PLN is the only state utility company that is doing the power provision. They receive the Syariah financing up to 300 million rupiah, for example, for transmission and distribution. So this is the first part. And then for toll road projects, up to 800 million US dollar, for example, has been arranged using Islamic financing, Musyakarah and Murabaha. And then also the plan for international Islamic universities being developed. Now the project is undergoing feasibility study, for example. And the plan is to have both blended financing, at which the government will contribute some funding, and also Islamic financing will be mobilized for project implementation. And then still early in the process is the use of hedge fund. The use of hedge fund for infrastructure projects. So it's quite politically sensitive when the concept first introduced. But then with the political commitment, eventually the government is able to issue such policy. So with about $6 billion available in hedge fund, the hedge fund has been committed to be used for about 20 infrastructure projects that is going to be channeled through capital market. So it's not going to be a direct financing, but some packaging and structuring will be done by the investment fund so that the funding can be offered to the projects. So I think these last 3 slides is basically summing up what we are going to do in the next 5 years in enlarging the contribution of Islamic financing in Indonesian infrastructure project development.
Okay, thank you, Pak Airman. Normally in Indonesia, they call it Pak for Mr. It's an honorable term. Let me just give you a brief background. You see the term here, he showed here the term called Sharia finance. You have the term called Islamic finance. You have the term called Sharia finance. You have a term called participatory finance, and you have a term called interest-free finance. All of them are the same. For example, in Nigeria, they call it interest-free finance. In Turkey, they call it participation finance. The same goes for Morocco. Morocco also call it participation finance. And then Indonesia call it Sharia finance. And of course, the rest of the world call it Islamic finance. But they are essentially responsible finance or ethical finance. But coming back just to share with you, like India, Indonesia's Islamic finance started from bottom up rather than top down, which means that it's the population wants Islamic finance. And subsequently, the government filled that void, that requirement. Whereas in the context of Malaysia, it is both bottom up as well as top down. The people want it together with the government, so there was a strong. But now you see the government of Indonesia is quite similar to Malaysia. It is a bottom up and top down. The government is serious in implementing Islamic finance together with the local population. But also you see the example here is that it's a combination of not only purely sukuk, because we have been talking about sukuk just now. It's not purely sukuk. It's also syndicated financing. So they have syndicated financing, Sharia compliant syndicated financing. They have sukuk, and they have also blended financing for infrastructure projects. And bear in mind, infrastructure projects is very much Sharia compliant. It meets the Sharia principles. You have the project, and you have the return from the project. So you can then quite easily structure a very simple structure to meet those requirements, meeting the Sharia requirements, at the same time meeting the requirements of the SDGs, which I have not asked. Later on, I will ask him about the green sukuk that was issued by the government of Indonesia, just for your information. But now, let me go to Mr. S. Krishnan.
Can I take back, because I didn't have the clicker, I couldn't move through the slides.
Okay,
so I'll breeze through.
You want to?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I didn't have the clicker.
Okay.
I couldn't move the slides.
Okay.
Could I please have that? Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So we'll get Brother Hamid again?
Yes.
Okay.
Could I please have the Fintera slides?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So I kind of got stuck because of this little device, and this is a technology device, and I come from technology, so kind of stuck. So, Assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. I'm Hamid Rashid from Fintera, and like Prof. Azmi asked, what is Fintech doing to raise capital for large infrastructure projects? Now, infrastructure projects could be, endowment-based or commercial-based, and the Fintera project, when we wrote this white paper or the research paper last year, looked very specifically into Awqaf or WIEF development. And we very specifically focused around the macro-microeconomics and also the financial formulas within capital raising versus a technology. But unfortunately, the project became technology at the end of it. Okay. So that's the Fintera project. Now, Fintera, the technology itself is something called the blockchain technology. Now, I'm not too sure if many of you have heard of such a technology. I just want to have a quick raise of hand. Have you heard of anything called the blockchain? Okay. Makes my life very difficult. I think hardly about a dozen people. So I got to explain what is a blockchain. And every time you say blockchain, everybody kind of think of the cryptocurrency or the Bitcoin. How many of you know anything about the Bitcoin or cryptocurrency? So I think a little bit more people know about that. So makes my life more difficult because I got to detach that. Now, the whole purpose of me getting in this space is because of my background in research and development in technology for the last 15 years, and where I was given a task to design a new formula for capital raising out of the standard banking environment. And that's what fintechs do. They look out of the box, and they look into a sandbox kind of an environment to play with the regulations within the regulatory sandbox. And we develop something which is piloted, and if it works out, it becomes mainstream. Okay? So that's what we did. We toyed around with something very disruptive, like the blockchain, and it is very chaotic because blockchain is only about 4-year mainstream technology. It's not been very well used in mainstream industry. So we try to give some order into this chaos. And this blockchain, whenever I say blockchain around the world, right, people take it as Bitcoin. And why we take it as Bitcoin? Because this is what we have heard the most. Bitcoin rallies, the peaks and troughs have been 30, 40%. A lot of people made money, a lot of people lost money, and that's why we associate blockchain with Bitcoin. But, to break the bubble, no. There is nothing to do between blockchain and Bitcoin. Blockchain is the operating system. It's the platform that runs the Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. But blockchain is not Bitcoin. It's two separate things. That's the first thing to remember. And blockchain, it's this big white elephant. It's a new technology. That's what everybody think, right? But actually, it has a whole architecture. It's nothing new. It's just an amalgamation of few different technologies that were put together in the last 4 years. And those technologies were around security, encryption, networking, database, and operating system. When all of this was put together, it created a new technology called the blockchain. And now different people, touch it or view it from different angles and believe it is something different, but no, it is nothing more than, amalgamation of all the technologies. Now, the key features within the blockchain, it's feature of security and looking at security from a encryption view versus an antivirus view. So encryption is a key feature of the blockchain. Now, distributed network versus centralized network. In the last 15, 20 years of internet development and also internet-based services, IT has always looked at centralization of services, where there is a central server, say the main branch of a bank, and then all the branches tying into the main branch. That is central network environment. Versus blockchain took the view of decentralizing it, where the database, the ledger, exists everywhere on every node or on every server. So it just makes it easy, and fast to have the services. And of course, it is completely automated, where there is no involvement of a human being validating, like auditing transactions. Everything is done on computers. So in gist, that is the blockchain. Now, the biggest challenge of blockchain, right, in the last 4 years has been regulatory compliance, whether it is the central banking, the Financial Services Act, or the Securities Commission compliance. And in the early days, right, of the blockchain, things like Bitcoin, was used in illicit trade or was used for money remittances cross-border without KYC, AML, so it became anonymous with illegal trades. But regulatory compliances are coming in. The Malaysian Central Bank has released a crypto regulatory framework, at least, which is a sandbox framework. Malta, Gibraltar, right, and few other countries have very advanced stage regulations, which are the DLT exchange and DLT frameworks. So because of the regulatory compliance, the mainstream enterprises have failed to use the technology in abundance, right? And that's why there are not so many use cases out there today, right, which is growing, but there are not so many to reference to. Now, if you look at statistics, right, out there, now, based on this, Gartner, right, what Gartner is saying, by 2030, 550 billion US dollars worth of crypto assets are within blockchain. And if you compare it to national GDP and national market capitalization, blockchain would be equal to the 20th country in the world, larger than Malaysia, larger than Saudi Arabia, surprisingly. So 550 billion US dollar worth of US dollar worth of assets are stuck within the blockchain today, and it is growing. Okay. Now, blockchain is a disruptor, right? And Finterra is in a space to look into disruptive technology and to harness the power of it for a very specific business use case. And that business use case was a paradigm shift, which is how could we use the blockchain to generate capital for the development of Awqaf or Waqf. So it is a paradigm shift. It is not a disruption. So let me show you how this paradigm shift comes along. Now, to do this, what we had to do was that our white paper was funded by a venture capitalist, and we set up the Finterra organization, and we are present in all of these countries right now. Also, a team was put together, so these are the senior management team, and right now about 60 people within Finterra group are working to develop this technology, and look at this alternative financing model to run off the blockchain. Now, the technology that came out from the last 10 months of work is called the Galactic Blockchain. And why it is so special compared to any other blockchain that exists out there is because it took regulatory framework at heart. So it looks into the FSA, the Financial Services Act, the IFSA, Islamic Financial Services Act, and also Sharia compliance. And it builds that within the architecture of the blockchain, just like a core banking system. I mean, a bank or an enterprise will not buy or adopt an accounting system if it doesn't follow the accounting practice or the core banking practice. So likewise, why would enterprise and regulators accept and adopt any blockchain if it doesn't comply to the FSA and IFSA? So this is what the Finterra project did, was to build an operating system called the Galactic Operating System, which complies to regulatory framework. And on this regulatory framework is what we are building the solution called the endowment chain or the Waqf chain. So this is an application running on the platform called the Galactic Platform. And what the objectives of this project from original intent was unlocking the locked liquidity in endowment of Waqf assets. Now, based on the Waqf Act itself, right, or Awqaf Act itself, as a Commonwealth, or common law act, there are certain limitations within it, right? Limitations of collateralization, limitation of liquidation, limitation of transfer, and it just goes on. Now, because of that, the standard financial institutions out there do not want to fund Awqaf because of collateralization. If they cannot collateralize the asset itself, in the case of default, they cannot liquidate. They cannot liquidate, so they just don't want to. So the traditional way, since 1914, First World War till today, has been through charity, donations, and government grants. That is the only way Awqaf receives its capital, other than the little revenue they generate, to further build on the Awqaf assets. Now, by unlocking the liquidity, by looking into the macroeconomic formulas, right, of capital raising and the financial capital raising formulas and the Islamic finance instrument, we can actually tweak Awqaf capital raising to the pre-1914 during the Osmania period. Now, during the Osmania period, Awqaf was taken as a profit center versus post-1914 is being taken as a cost center. So whoever knows accounting here knows that the accounting for of revenue center versus cost center is very different accounting practice, where revenue center looks into generating revenue from an asset, and only the revenue generated from the fixed asset is used, and the capital is always at par or secure, versus cost center, which actually uses the capital and it burns the capital over a period of time where there is nothing left. So this is what the Finterra project looked into, and we devised a new formula that could be used by financial institution, built on a technology like blockchain, and which could help. Now, the project background is to raise capital for the development of Waqf real estate. assets and projects. So what the system actually does, and you see the architecture there of the blockchain and the features that are built within it. Now, it has a whole ecosystem of features. And those features are things like the Waqf or Awqaf board management itself, financial auditing of the Awqaf and the transactions that happen there, fund management of the capital that is raised and how it manages the fund, the crypto token issuance. Now, the word crypto itself is quite controversial. I'll come to it later. That within technology, crypto, when we say crypto token, in technology, coin versus a smart contract are very different. So things like a crypto token, like Ethereum, is a ERC20 token, which is a currency-based token, versus a smart contract, which is a ERC777, is only a digital contract. It is not a currency. Okay? So in technology, there are big differentiation, which regulators need to catch up to. Also, the crypto token crowd sale, where you actually put out smart contracts that are instrumented like Mudaraba Musharaka or Sukuk and raise capital against those digital assets that are contracted and built on Islamic principles. Okay? Building constructions management and the tendering process, of awarding Awqaf development, the asset management, and of course the insurance and takaful. How do they play? So these are the founding, little stones in building that system. Now the system wasn't built just, by engineers. There was a lot of help that came from specialists like Dr. Hassan from Maybank Islamic Sharia Compliance, Dr. Professor Khalid Rashid from the Waqf itself, with over 50 years of research experience in Waqf, Dr. Omar Hussaini, specializing in Waqf law, and also Saifuddin Arif, I think he's somewhere here in the crowd, from legal compliance and the Waqf, advisory. So not only these people, but many others contributed into that research and into forming up and into that modeling that has been now formed up and called the Waqf chain on the Fintera, blockchain. I would like to share this with you.
In a world where poverty thrives, 1 in 3 families live without adequate shelter, 1 in 7 families live without access to health care, and 1 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day. 22,000 children die each day due to poverty. The solution is not new. For decades, the successful development and management of Islamic assets have been based on 3 key components. Zakat is a form of almsgiving, treated in Islam as a religious obligation. Sadaqah, concept of sincere, voluntary giving of alms or charity. And Waqf, an endowment of property to be held in trust. One of the most notable achievements for society by Islamic civilization was the ideation of the charitable endowment known as Waqf. Waqf was popularized by the Ottoman Empire by a means of welfare financing and poverty alleviation. Waqf was the helping hand that supported the state in its welfare activities for centuries. As the sun set on the Islamic Empire, the current Waqf assets are roughly estimated to be over $1 trillion. Yet most of these funds sit dormant due to the shift of focus from social welfare to religious pursuit. In today's information and technological age, does Waqf have wider scope and appeal, where there will be more than 5.6 billion smartphone users by 2019, where 55% of the global population is on the internet, 37% of the global population is on social media, and there's more than 1.5 trillion in annual global e-commerce transactions. Fintera utilizes the power of information technology to bridge communities and aims to rejuvenate and rekindle the power of Waqf development. In this spirit, we at Fintera and the IWBF are bringing forward a solution from the past to solve the challenge of the moment by harnessing the power of blockchain. Waqf will once again be the hallmark of Muslim charitable endowment in its quest to end poverty. Fintera, the financial frontier.
Thank you. Just 2 minutes. So coming down to the gist right here in the underlying why this project was undertaken was based on this ayah from the Quran, right? Where charity, is being promoted, and charity is told to us that if you give in charity, it comes back to you in the hereafter. But today, if we do a general survey globally, and we ask how many of us give sadaqah, I think majority do, or actually all do give sadaqah. If we do a survey on how many of us give zakat, right? Maybe not majority, but a great deal of people do give zakat. But if you ask how many of you give waqaf, very rare it is that people give waqaf. Now, there has to be a differentiation between sadaqah and zakat, where the asset, right, sadaqah is where it is given and consumed, versus waqaf, where it is given, and then that asset it generates the revenue, and that revenue is what goes into charity. But the asset, the underlying asset remains. So by democratizing the waqaf itself and the availability of it via the blockchain, just gives opportunity to everyone, the common man on the street, to participate in waqaf. And that is done through, I'll just go straight to, the model itself is done through this blockchain model, right? And this ecosystem that is created within the system. What it does is that it takes the waqaf or waqaf assets and it builds projects on that. That project gets published and gets audited by financial auditors. And if the project is feasible, it gets launched as a fund from the fund manager. Okay? And the fund manager launches it based on instruments. So if it is a non-revenue generating asset, like say a mosque or an orphanage, then instruments like cash waqaf, permanent and temporary, Islamic loans could be used. But if it is a revenue-based asset, like a hospital, school, shopping mall, or whatever else that generates revenue, then instruments like Mudaraba Musharaka or Mudaraba Musharaka-based sukuks could be launched. Now, when I say launch, on a blockchain, they are built as a smart contract. And those smart contracts are launched for sale similar to share offering or prospectus. And those prospectus are seen by potential investors or donors. They can be individuals, they could be corporate CSR, or they could be international WIEF donors who actually pick up these smart contracts, and their fiat funds go back to the fund manager. Fund managers get involved in the construction of the asset. Asset gets transferred to asset management. Asset management generates the revenue and the profitability, which goes back to the users depending on their Mudaraba, Musharaka contracts and the Sukuk dividend contracts, okay? And Takaful is involved in ensuring the capital in case the fund manager liquidates, and also ensuring the asset itself. So this is the total ecosystem that is built within the Waqaf chain that Fintera has built. Now, we have promoted this in almost 9 countries at a regulatory level, and it has been very much adopted, right, and accepted, endorsed by these regulators to pilot it at least in a sandbox environment in their countries. Now, in the last 10 months, we have achieved 700,000 over donors registered on the platform, and 9 countries are part of endorsements into it. Multiple awards have been received for this project and the technology that has been developed. Just in the last month, the Beijing government has given, because of the IP and patents that came out of this technology. The Awqaf of Bahrain and the Ministry of Finance has endorsed this, and they would like to pilot it under the central bank sandbox within Bahrain. And we have promoted it. This was the first conference where we presented the paper, and the paper was endorsed, right, to proceed on the project. We presented it in the GCC as well in Dubai, right, to the GCC regulators in May. We have been invited by multiple agencies to showcase this, that the agency want to use it for corporate CSR. And why? Because they want total transparency on the dollar that they contribute, right? And a technology like the blockchain gives them the last mile transparency on the money that gets donated or contributed via the different instruments. So thank you. This is the Fintera project. Yeah.
Can we, because we need to go to the third
Yes.
speaker. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hamid.
Thank you.
Yes, given that we are already almost 1 o'clock, I would like now to call upon Mr. S. Krishnan, the Principal Secretary to the Government of Tamilnadu, in charge of housing and urban development. So I'm sure he'll be focusing on the real estate side. But as you can see earlier on, Mr. Hamid talks about real estate development using blockchain, and it can be based on WAKAF. Sorry, it can be based on Suku as well. So, Mr. Krishnan?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me first thank WIEF and UEF for having brought such a galaxy of speakers with knowledge and experience from so many countries here to Chennai. So let me welcome you all to Chennai, and thank you for your presence here, and thank you for the various ideas and various concepts that have been presented today. In the case of Tamil Nadu, I would just like to quickly run through. I'll skip some of the slides because I have a colleague who's speaking later in the afternoon who would probably cover some of those aspects, and then go straight to some of the innovative financial vehicles we are trying to look at for infrastructure development. You see, Tamil Nadu is one of the most attractive growth spots in India. It's already the second largest economy, and a lot of investment takes place here. But I would like to call attention to 2 points which are relevant. One is that it's the most urbanized large state in India. Almost 50% of the population lives in urban areas. That brings its own set of challenges. And a lot of that relates to housing, which is the area, and shelter, which is probably one of the biggest challenges in the urban areas that we face as a development question. And the second element is that the nature of human resource in Tamil Nadu. One of the reasons why it's an attractive destination is because it has a lot of skilled human resources. It has the highest enrollment in tertiary education in India. And most investors, when you ask them why they want to come to Tamil Nadu, they cite the availability of skilled human resources as the main reason. Its presence across different sectors, I won't spend much more time on this. It also has a fairly heavy, fairly substantial infrastructure base. You might wonder, why are we focusing more on investment in infrastructure if you already have a reasonable base? It's a reasonable base in an Indian context, but then I think the main goal that we are looking at here is comparability to what is happening elsewhere in the world. And it is aspirational in a day and age when social media and electronic media brings everybody on par, and people see what is going on across the world, not just in the Western world, but what is going on across Southeast Asia, across the Middle East, and everywhere else. It is similar standards that people would aspire to in a country like India as well. Like I mentioned, housing is a big challenge in India, particularly in Tamil Nadu, where I think my department today is gearing to one of the largest investment challenges we are looking at in the housing sector, because in the next 5 to 6 years, we would need to build nearly about 1 million houses. And in the government sector, forget about what gets built in the private sector, which is fairly large. In the government sector, we need to be building about at least 500,000 houses in the next 5 years, which represents a very large investment, both from what in Indian terms we would say would be about 60,000 crore rupees, and that would amount to almost about $60 billion, which would need to get invested in that sector. The government of Tamil Nadu set up somewhat similar to the Indonesian example, which my co-speaker just talked about, the Tamil Nadu Infrastructure Development Board in 2012, which is basically to take care of this whole ecosystem of better project preparation and making sure that good contracting, good procurement takes place. There is funding for all of these areas, so we already have that ecosystem to do that. But somewhere we felt that within the government system, and there was a lack of adequate appreciation of the innovative ways in which you could finance this. Conventional financing, and in that, to some extent, I would even include public-private partnerships, because we have done a fair number of public-private partnerships, were already tried, tested, and a number of mechanisms had been looked at. So around the same time, in 2012, I think we had a fresh opportunity. Here, I'd like to just say that Tamilnadu has always kept pace as a state, and in fact has been ahead of the curve as far as the national scene, the Indian level scene is concerned, in looking at financial intermediation. In 1949, we set up the Industrial Investment Corporation, which was the precursor to the state finance corporations, which were set up under a National Act in 1951, fundamentally to finance industrial investment. Then in the 70s, 80s, we set up special purpose vehicles, non-banking financial companies, which raised deposits to fund transport, to fund the power sector, and so on, which did well and continue to do well, but have certain limitations from a regulatory perspective. And we tried to look at an alternative model in 1996 to look at urban infrastructure finance, where we merge both private financing and public financing, and we bring in more and more skills from the private sector into the way the institution itself is structured. That was the Tamil Nadu Urban Infrastructure Financial Services Limited and the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Fund. In a sense, that became the model for the urban development projects which the government of India pushed thereafter. And there was bond raising. Some of those modes of financing were typical bonds, typical debt instruments, and so on. And we also partnered with a number of financial intermediaries from the private sector, including HDFC, and of course, ILFS is probably not the best name to speak of now, but they were also our partners at that point. Then in 2016, I think what we realized were two things. One, that there was an opportunity to look at more innovative financial instruments based on the way that regulations were changing, and looking at what the Securities and Exchange Board of India was starting to permit as alternate investment vehicles, alternate investment funds, and the need to generate more resources. Because we had launched what was called the Vision Tamil Nadu 2023 in 2012. There was a need to fund nearly about $250 billion worth of projects, infrastructure projects. Number of projects were identified, and we needed to see how financing could be structured to bring in money for these kind of projects. So which is when we set up which is when we examined the various kind of instruments which would be available. There were, of course, the alternate investment funds, which mimic private equities, which mimic hedge funds to some extent, and also social impact funds. REITs were spoken of in an earlier session. REITs are, again, and infrastructure investment trusts are something which get permitted. Then, of course, the mutual funds, both the real estate mutual funds and also the debt mutual funds, and then various kind of structured instruments. So all of these could again be adapted to the housing sector in terms of what needed to be done, particularly for affordable housing, and which is why we said there is a need to explore what is it that we can do with SEBI, which is our securities regulator, as opposed to the financial regulator, which is the Reserve Bank of India. So we needed to look at a set of SEBI-regulated instruments. Now, some of the challenges which we face typically in the government sector, and some of those are linked to the kind of challenges you face for, say, even Islamic compliant banking or Sharia compliant instruments, is a lack of understanding in the public sector in particular as to how monies could be used, and that it is just not tax-based revenue. You just don't go back to your budget officer and ask for money, and a lot of it comes through. There were problems in terms of project preparation which needed to be sorted out. There were also issues in terms of how do we get the funding models and the business models well aligned right at the beginning, rather than try to solve the problems later. And again, the conflicts of interest, which were very common when many of these issues came up, and today, if you look at the ILFS story, some of it actually relates to conflicts of interest. So all of these issues were challenges which we required to address, and which is where then we thought of the Tamilnadu Infrastructure Fund Management Company, which was set up in 2015, and fundamentally, we wanted an arm's length entity where the government is a promoter. At the same time, it is, in order to build trust amongst investors who come in, we need to make sure that it is professionally managed, and government's hand in that is very light. So we first went to a model which said that the government holding in this will be limited to 26%. We are not getting more than that. We also structured it in such a way that we take a wide variety of financial institutions, both banks, insurance companies, and a range of other entities, including international entities, in order to give it the necessary legitimacy and give it the necessary freedom and the independence to function as an effective investment vehicle. You also recruit high-quality talent by having market-linked remuneration structures and get in people who can understand what the market requires, and at the same time get in people who have an understanding of what the government system needs. So it is an institution which links both of them, and at the same time, you also have very strong oversight, because that becomes very important in a context where you have to sort of make sure that ultimately the public interest gets protected, because any form of infrastructure, anything which gets created has that issue. Our initial partners overseas, we had the Asian Development Bank giving us some assistance. We also had the Japanese International Cooperation Agency giving us some assistance in setting up this whole idea. And then we set up two infrastructure AIFs, one which is the Tamilnadu Infrastructure Fund. That was launched, and today I think my minister would have also mentioned it, the Deputy Chief Minister would have mentioned it in his address in the morning. We have done the first close. We've also raised international money, incidentally from an Islamic-based fund in the Middle East, and close to more than 300 million US dollars have been raised into that fund, which is in the process of getting deployed. In the case of the Social Welfare Fund, we have an initial commitment from the government of, from the Tamil Nadu Housing Board, because that is basically intended for for shelter, as a shelter fund initiative, as a social impact fund, and even there we have commenced our process. Just to give you a quick idea of how these instruments work, the Tamil Nadu Infrastructure Fund totally targets eventually a 2 billion asset base and $2 billion US asset base. And we are basically looking at infrastructure projects which relate to Tamil Nadu. It need not necessarily be in Tamil Nadu. For all you know, it could be shipping coal from, say, Indonesia to ports in Tamil Nadu for setting up power plants. So that could be an infrastructure thing we could actually fund. But linked to Tamil Nadu, the kind of infrastructure instruments that we can do, we have multiple equity classes within that. It is a shareholding class. It is not a bond or a debenture. So the financing is a share of profits in a real asset which gets created in terms of a infrastructure asset. And as I already mentioned, we have done our first close. We have raised $300+ billion already, and it's typically a 10-year instrument which sort of lasts over 10 years with a 2 years exit. We have a number of projects which are already lined up where monies would be signed off very shortly. It's a very reasonable management fee structure so that to make it attractive, the targeted rate is 14% ultimate returns, and as I already mentioned, it's it's a rate of return in terms of what gets paid back as profit sharing on the asset. It's not necessarily an interest. There's no assured interest as such which is paid out. There could be some guarantees in certain assets based on what the government says it would repay. There is a guarantee structure for that, but beyond that, it's not a thing. It's not an interest-based payment. Similarly, the shelter fund is a social impact fund. Therefore, we are looking at a slightly lower rate of return there and a lower fee structure. And it's also a shorter duration fund because fundamentally it's oriented towards creating one kind of asset, which is housing. And as a result of that, we are holding the maturity period a little lower than a typical infrastructure which pays back over a much longer period. And this goes both of these funds, both the infrastructure fund and the shelter fund, are available to fund projects both in the private sector and in the public sector. We typically earlier instruments or earlier institutions only funded public sector assets, but we have kept this open to fund assets as long as they meet the overall objectives, they meet these assets. And the second thing is, the investment decisions out of these funds are taken by an independent investment committee, which is not linked with the government at all. It's independent professionals outside the government sector who take these ultimate final decisions on whether a particular project needs to be invested in. The issue arises, the current level of preparedness, as I already mentioned, we've already raised the money. There are transactions which are at a very advanced stage where we have to just sign off. Based on approvals, investors can access our data room. We've raised $312 million US, as I mentioned, and the possibility of raising more money, and we have the capacity in the infrastructure fund to go up to $2 billion, and we have resources there. Now, some of the things that I'd just like to highlight here is, first and foremost, is that there is a credit enhancement by either the promoter or the government, because the capital gets preserved, and that aspect is taken care of. The second part of it is, as I already mentioned, the returns basically come from profit participation, and it is clearly an asset-backed investment because there is a real asset which gets created primarily in the infrastructure stage, and the contracts can be structured in a way to suit what the investor requires, and we have that flexibility. I've already spoken about the kind of returns that we are looking at there. We are fully in conformity with what the SEBI, the regulator, requires of us, and we've taken care of those requirements. And a quick comparison of where we stand there. As I already mentioned, it is an investment in real assets. There's no question of investing it in financial assets or other speculative assets. There's no question of it is profit shares, and there is no interest payment out of this. It's clearly an instrument which causes profit shares. And again, there are no speculation, and there are no secondary assets in which these funds, and we do not invest in the stock market or any other speculative thing. But we can, of course, support investors who want to look at Sharia compliance. We can support investors to get that compliance done. And overall, if we see, certainly our investments are structured in a way that both in the social sector, and I think the emphasis, particularly from the Waqaf side, was made as to how it is intended for a social purpose. Definitely, our investments have a social purpose behind them, and I think they are very, very well tuned to an overall social impact investment, which is targeted in a significant part of Islamic compliant bonds, Islamic compliant financing, and certainly that's something we can handle here. and we can certainly structure these as outcome-based bonds because really the returns pay off only when the outcomes are realized, when the social outcomes are realized, and that's something we can certainly structure for you. And we can certainly create a subclass for whatever size, whatever appetite is there, to see that it includes, redevelopment of Waqaf property. A colleague of mine in the government actually looks after this, and possibly he would attend a later session this afternoon, and we can actually discuss that element of it as well. So this is what I would like to many of the investors, many of the others who are present here today. I think I would like to point out to you that we are probably the only state in India which can actually give you a structured product where this investment can straight away take place. And I'm sure, given the kind of model that Fintera is talking about, I'm sure we can even adapt to a fintech-based model which will attract this kind of investment. Let me hasten to add that this is not the only compliant investment that we can have. Infrastructure in Tamilnadu offers multiple other opportunities, and there are multiple other investment opportunities, but this was a ready-made instrument which we have structured and which is available, which I thought I would present to you here today. My colleague speaking in the afternoon session will perhaps speak about the other investment opportunities which we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, gentlemen, we have 3 speakers. I think the last speaker, as Krishnan, talks about financing, which is Sharia compliant, although you may not call it Sharia compliant, but it is a financing that meets the principle of Sharia compliant using the fund approach. So we have a discussion on the sukuk structure. We have the blockchain sukuk can use blockchain. And finally, we have 2 funds, infrastructure and social impact funds, that meet the Sharia requirement and meets the impact objective. I'm not sure whether we have the time, because I got a message from the organizer, yes, that we have to wrap up, so there is no opportunity for question and answer session. But I'm sure the panel members would love to answer your questions over lunchtime. So with that, I hand over to the chairman of the session, yes.
Thank you, sir. Can I have a big round of applause for the panelists and the moderator, please? An excellent session, especially one from our Principal Secretary, sir, showing how Tamil Nadu's economic stability is growing in leaps and bounds, and there's so much of planning going into it. Augurs well for all of us who want to invest in Tamil Nadu and the team that's come from abroad as well. Thank you so much, sir. God bless. So we have a group photo session. Can I request the panelists and the moderator to please stand up? There'll be a lot of questions, I'm sure, but you can ask that over lunch. I'm sure they will stay back for lunch. I request you all to have a very quick lunch and be back by 2 p.m. We will start the next session sharp at 2 o'clock. So I request you all to be back by then. And once again, to remind you, if you're posting any photos on Facebook or Instagram, or if you're tweeting about the event today, do not forget to put on the hashtag Chennai Roundtable. So hashtag Chennai Roundtable on social media, tag your photos.